In front of the loggia, a small terraced garden and 6 steps leading to a crenellated covered walkway. Down below, a landscape divided in two by a river flowing from the mountains. Half-timbered houses and paths that lead off to the countryside. An island with a castle. The ramparts are flanked with large towers. The walls stretch out into the countryside to allow for the city's future growth, a characteristic of urban planning during this period. People enter the churches, walk by the stalls nestled at the base of the cathedral, go off to work in the fields. Women chat on their doorsteps. Many people cross the bridge on foot and on horseback. They go from left to right. Others ferry across the river in the opposite direction. Barges full of wares are docked along the quays. Moored in the current, watermills harness the river's energy. In this familiar setting, historians have claimed to identify the spire of Utrecht Cathedral, the vaulted bridge in Liège, the St. Gudule Cathedral in Brussels, or the Burgundy countryside. They have also suggested Bruges, Lyon, Prague, and even Autun. But although some elements may have been borrowed from reality, the landscape is wholly imaginary. Nicholas Roland's position as Chancellor, or Minister of Finance, enabled him to accumulate a vast fortune of which his native city of Autun partially reaped the benefits. In the heart of Autun is the St. Lazarus Cathedral, famous for its Judgment Day tympanum, its Romanesque capitals, and its Gothic spire. Nearby is Nicholas Roland's mansion, today a museum. Roland was a patron of the arts who supported copyists and illuminators. He lavished his riches on the parish of Notre-Dame du Châtel, a church located between his mansion and the cathedral. The painting was commissioned for a chapel founded by the Chancellor's ancestors. The scene seemed to be lit by the light of the altar, before which Roland was kneeling. A few years later, Roland, founder of the Bowen Hospital, commissioned Roger van der Weyden to paint the Judgment Day altarpiece. The Chancellor and his third wife, Guillaume de Salin, were portrayed on the outer panel. Portraits of donors attest to the rise of an opulent bourgeoisie to artistic patronage. Repeated gestures of piety were also Roland's attempt to dispel the poor reputation associated with his past of Chancellor. At the end of the Gothic period, the Duchy of Burgundy formed an alliance with Flanders and the Low Countries. Jan van Eyck and his brother Hubert painted the magnificent Ghent altarpiece, the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, 20 panels and hundreds of figures, angels, prophets, and evangelists. Adam and Eve are among the first nudes in Northern European painting. Other works include portraits of Cardinal Albergati, Margaret van Eyck, the painter's wife, a burgess goldsmith, and religious subjects, such as the Lucca Madonna and the Dresden Triptych. The man in a red turban may be a self-portrait. The painter also portrayed himself in The Virgin with the Canon van der Pauw as a small figure in a red turban in the reflection of St. George's armor. In Giovanni Arnolfini and his Bride, the painter shows his reflection in the mirror and wrote above it, "Jan van Eyck was here." Often on the frames of his paintings he inscribed his motto, "Als ik kan," as I can. As in most of his other paintings, Madonna with Chancellor Roland was probably set in a dated and signed carved wooden frame. The church was destroyed during the French Revolution. In 18,000, the painting, which had remained in Autun, was sent to the Louvre. A 16th century engraver imagined the Van Eyck brothers' studio. A wood panel is delivered. A worker grinds the pigments. Another mixes them with linseed oil. A third places the paint on the palette. Apprentices make sketches. One of the brothers paints a religious figure. The other does a woman's portrait. The nearly square panel is made up of 3 oak planks with a vertical grain. These planks have warped slightly. In places, the joints are visible. The panels were prepared using methods still practiced by violin makers and fine cabinet makers. Choosing the wood, sawing it in the proper direction, sanding, grooving, and joining it were all important steps towards preserving the work. Dendrochronology is the science of dating wood by comparing the seasonal growth of the tree rings. Close analysis shows that planks 1 and 3 come from the same tree, planted around 1215. Plank 2 comes from a tree planted in 1247. They were probably harvested in 1426. The blocks of wood dried for at least 10 years. So the panel was probably made around 1436. The panel was coated with gesso, a mixture of glue and plaster of Paris. After the first few coats were applied to swell the grain of the wood, it was sanded. Thick coats were then applied and sanded each time until the surface became as hard and smooth as ivory. A detailed sketch was then made with a thin brush, as can be seen in St. Barbara of Antwerp, an unfinished painting in which the objects and figures were lightly sketched in, and the shading was done in thin hatching. Infrared rays penetrate pigments to show layers of underpainting. By examining each area of the painted surface, one can see the initial sketch, which reveals subsequent changes the painter made to his original composition. The most obvious hidden detail is the large purse on the Chancellor's right hip. It contained the seal of the Duke of Burgundy and was the symbol of Roland's position. Roland may have asked the painter to erase this object, for it might have been read as too clear an allusion to his enormous fortune. It may also have been the Chancellor himself who asked the painter to change the position of Christ's hand so as to be blessed by him. Until Van Eyck, paint was prepared by mixing pigments with egg yolk. Many masterpieces were produced in this medium, called tempera, but it was difficult to work with. Legend credits Van Eyck with the discovery of oil paint, but in fact this technique was known as early as the 12th century. Linseed oil dried too slowly. Van Eyck is said to have discovered that by mixing oil with turpentine, it dried much faster. Turpentine, distilled from the sap of certain pine trees, dissolves greasy substances and hence thins the pigments prepared with oil. Oil lends greater saturation to colors and maintains their brightness. It dries slowly, so can be reworked. It is particularly suited to producing textural effects. Thinner paint also allows the artist to apply tiny details by using a brush with few hairs. The figures standing on the bridge are less than a millimeter high. Van Eyck demonstrated this virtuosity in several other paintings. The advantage of oil paint is obvious in the technique known as glazing, layering coats of thin translucent paint. For the drape of the red cloth, the painter first applied a glaze of the same shade over the entire surface. The glaze left the sketch visible, but gave it a sense of greater depth. Then, for the shadows of the cloth and to shape the folds, he would use a darker shade of red. Finally, he added highlights using a lighter red. Deep white cracks run through the Madonna's robe. Infrared photography makes this even more visible.